All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Wednesday. It is Vibrant time. I'm super excited for this talk. Ever since I first met Mark, we've had incredible conversations, de-inverting various upside down paradigms. And I thought, since I had him on the schedule for this Wednesday, and Topher was absolutely pestering me to come back on, I thought these two gentlemen really ought to meet. And the overarching premise that I want to put as the umbrella for this conversation is to refer back to this podcast I did 2 weeks ago with Mario Garza, where we talked about Rene Guénon's The Reign of Quantity and the Signs of the Times. So if there was one psychologically inverted paradigm that rules them all, if you want to say that, I think it is this quantitative over qualitative aspect. So there's a few things that come out of that, like the idea that matter does not produce qualities out of itself, but qualities as essential metaphysical thing, or not even things, metaphysical essences, right? Condense into matter. And as I heard a guest of Topher's on a recent show of his say, if it's all agreed that the universe is made of energy, then we don't have an energy crisis. We have an ignorance crisis. So there's a lot to discuss here. Topher is one of the best alternative physics guys around. Mark is one of the most all-around intelligent guys I know and best researchers on his journalistic approach to really evidence-based refutation of widely held incorrect paradigms. So I'm stoked that we're going to get this thing going. Mark, how you been, man?
I've been well, talking about these topics a lot, which I enjoy, and I know this is going to be a great conversation.
Topher, buddy.
Good to see you again. Twice in 4 days. This is an incredible chance.
Yeah, we did a luncher on Sunday. Good time.
Yeah, it was really nice.
He held my baby the whole time.
Oh, well, your
Total
baby
baby
is such a wonderful sleeper. That's a blessing.
That's just you. She doesn't like to take naps during the day, but Topher, I want to just let you and Mark kind of feel each other out and have some introductions and lay the groundwork for the stuff we're going to talk about today.
Cool. Well, Mark, I'm a handsy guy. I build domes, and in building domes, I got into domes because domes are resonant structures, and working with resonant structures was very, I guess you would say, alluring to me, just because in my training in Ayurvedic massage, I was dealing with lots of different elemental energies in people's bodies. And I got to work in very, very good, I guess you would say spas, like beautiful spas. And so I was learning what these different shapes that I was working in, how that actually affected my clients, and then how that affected me. And then so my methodologies are very hands-on, is the easiest way I could say without boring you with all the stuff. And I've been blessed with a lot of time to experiment. So I've experimented with magnetics. I've experimented with everything dealing with hydrology, with flow dynamics, both with liquids and with heat. And I have a weird way of looking at things. I was kind of pushed through the lens of like the Steiner-esque Schauberger funnel through that area of Europe in the way I actually look at things. And I've just been trying to apply what I've learned from some of these great minds it's been close to 20 years now that I've really been applying that. So that's where I'm at in my journey.
Awesome. I have a bit of a different story, which is that I would say my journey into writing about the topics that I now speak about started in 2016. But prior to that, I had a totally mainstream life background. Went to Princeton, worked in investment banking in New York, worked in Silicon Valley advising tech companies. I would have considered myself an atheist or agnostic at the time. So I wasn't even thinking about energies or meaning or purpose in the universe. And that all shifted for me in 2016. Initially, I was listening to health podcasts and I heard about psychic phenomena and interdimensional beings. And that has led me on a journey of research. My first book, it's called An End to Upside Down Thinking. I actually didn't even come up with the title. It was I wrote the manuscript and my publisher said, I love it, but this is going to be the title, An End to Upside Down Thinking. And his name was Bill Gladstone. He recently passed away, but he was kind of a legend in the literary world. And so he probably had the foresight to know that maybe I wouldn't just write one book on things that were upside down. And he has seen so much that he probably knew that there was something about inversion that I was tapping into. In that book, I was looking at the materialist paradigm, the idea that matter is what generates consciousness and everything in the world, sort of like what Chance was describing, whereas it seems that perhaps that's inverted, that there might be something more qualitative or subjective that is the basis of reality, and what we call material is derived from that. So that general concept was the first inversion. And at the time, if you had asked me, I would have said, like, I'm not going to write any more books. I was still working in Silicon Valley, and but everyone was asking me, what are you going to write? What are you going to do next? Fast forward, because that book was published in 2018. End of 2019, I had done a podcast series called Where is My Mind? So kind of doubling down on that topic, interviewing scientists on near-death experiences and all sorts of phenomena. And then I hit this crossroads where I wanted to continue pursuing these more metaphysical ideas, but I had a great job. It was super stable. I was a partner at the firm at the time. I had worked my whole career to get there. Basically, I was in a great spot. And then I'm like, but there's this other stuff that I'm really passionate about. And I go into a business meeting and I would feel the energetic split. And it got to the point where I couldn't do it anymore. Told my business partners I was leaving, didn't know what I was going to do next. And then COVID hit, and that led me to look at many other paradigms. So long story short, I've written 7 books that all deal with upside down this and upside down that. I'm sure there are many more upside down topics that I haven't gotten into myself. But this notion of inversion it seems like it's inherent in our experience here. And I'll just pause there.
Yes. That's something I've explored a lot in my consciousness, is the inversion of history because of the building aspect of things. I just know what it takes to build both commercial and residential buildings. And a lot of what history has told us does not line up with actual physical matter that we see. So the inversion of history might be another thing that you're probably going to jump into and have fun with.
That's what I said. But that's a tough one. That's a tough topic.
There's so many elements of history, and you guys are not the first two. I see Mike Wilkerson saying upside down geology. Yeah.
Yes.
So many different possibilities. And I agree with you. I haven't looked deeply into all these areas, but I've seen enough to know that something's off. And what I find, Topher, is that basically if we're told something about any paradigm, we're told to just assume certain premises. And if you examine what those premises are, you realize that they're much shakier than we've been told. That's the pattern.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the big question is the psychological inversion that is applied everywhere. Is that intrinsic to our experience here? Or is that something that ebbs and flows, like on a cyclical pattern? Because that's what finally made things click for me about the idea of cycles of time, Kali Yuga, Golden Age, Iron Age, all that. Is basically there's like a teeter-totter between the quantitative and the qualitative perspective in humanity. And that on the descent, people become more and more obsessed with the physical substance, the sense-based material reality, at the expense of and losing track of the essence of things. But that at a certain point, maybe the bottom becomes the top. Maybe there's a point where the wheel stops, basically. The wheel of time comes to a halt and the process begins again from the top. You know, I obviously, I don't know, because I haven't been around for thousands and thousands of years to see how the pattern goes, but I like to think that there's some kind of impending shift, you know, rather than being the end of the world is coming, maybe the end of the inverted world is nigh. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I would think, I mean, this is the biggest question for me ever, is the inversion intrinsic? Because I'm somewhat of a person that believes and has experienced that, spirit. Like I really think that this is spiritual condensate, what we're in. Like this is spirit pretending to be matter. And I know in the past when these great books were written, and they were attributed to whatever god or whatever emissary of God, they would say things like, don't have any false idols, like this type of thing. And I think the world is actually engineered that way. Our creator has made it so if you have a false idol, like if you idolize something that's temporal, that's going to be obliterated at some point. Like you come here to do what you can and learn what you're supposed to learn. But if you're actually anchoring in and planting your flag, like this is an idol and this is where I'm going to receive my sustenance, I really think the provider of all just goes, oh, okay, you can have that for a little while. But the actual engineering and ergonomics of this whole, universe is there to be like, okay, that had its time and now it's gone.
Mm-hmm. Well, that notion reminds me of what many, let's just say, enlightened people talk about when they talk about dissolving the ego and getting to a state of reaching their true identity. Basically, they're saying letting go of all attachments to anything, because anything in this world is bound to that temporal trap that you're sort of describing. It's all temporary. It's not, at least, infinite in the way that we perceive it.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
All right, Topher, since Mark has recently put out a book on cosmology, and I know that you've got some epiphanies bubbling over from your recent travels and recent research and podcast guests, let's go in that direction a little bit. Let's lay some groundwork for that part of the conversation.
Yeah, I pretty much gave my cosmology in a very, very brief, in a brief iteration there. Essentially, what I've come to the conclusion in this moment in time, like right now, it's always up for modification. I don't even idolize my own, thoughts with these things. So as it stands now, the way I see this cosmos that we're in, I think it's a personal cosmos. It appears that we share it with others. But as far as I've known and with the amount of people I've worked with, everybody is having their own experience. And we pretend that we're having the same experience, but none of us have the same perspectives. None of us perceive the same way. And so for me, what I think this experience is we have a very private relationship that we project as a public relationship with everything. And the geography, it's like if you could imagine this is an envelope of spirit that is spiritual condensate. So it does have inertia. It does want to feel solid and all these things. And I don't really think that we're in as much control as it appears. There's just so many markers in life where it's just even if you are fully in control, like let's say you are like the arbiter of your own fate, it's statistically shown that outliering events are always what demarcate your mundane existence. Like, for example, none of us chose for 9/11 to happen, but ever since 9/11 happened as an outlier event, all of us, if we're flying commercial airlines, we have to go through the TSA. We didn't choose that, but that's something that has happened. None of us chose, the shenanigans that occurred in 2020 from a health perspective, but that affected all of us in a very interesting way. So I think on a very deep metaphysical level, what happens is God creates the path. He makes the story, but where we have agency is in our actual observation of it, our subjective interpretation of the objective reality that's put out in front of us. So there is a responsibility in that. I mean, you can see things as half empty or as half full. Like that is up to you, that aspect. But the actual sequencing of events and the events themselves, the more I've studied that, the more I've like looked into it, the more I've looked into people's astral bodies, the more I've actually worked on their physical bodies in relation to their astral bodies, the more it's very obvious to me that we are objectively impotent and subjectively omnipotent. And that's pretty much the cosmology I'm in. And depending on the way your particular body mind is tuned will have a lot to do with like what you actually experience in the quote unquote physical world. And, you know, it is birds of a feather flock together. You know, Chance, I know you're brilliant with the tuning forks and doing the biofield resonance and working with people's biofield anatomies. You know, these biofields, they resonate with each other. And from I guess if you're going to make it a personal perspective, when you love, the love is the great attractor, you know, that's gravity. And when you I won't say hate, but when there's apathy or whatever, there's the splitting apart, there's the energy that moves things apart. So but all of that is, you know, pretty much in the free will realm. It appears like we have the free will to do that, but I think most of that is fated. I know that's kind of controversial to say, but that's been my experience. And as somebody that has like a lot of things in my life that I've so-called created and have been pretty prolific at, the more those things happen, the more I recognize I'm not really at the reins of things. I'm just at the subjective, I guess you would say, the subjective decider of what those things are actually to me. So that's where I'm at in my particular cosmology.
I would say that aligns with a lot of what I've researched and how I think about things as well. It aligns also with this notion that life is happening for us, not to us. It's that everything is designed for you to go through a specific experience. And maybe that's happening to each of us simultaneously. Mm-hmm. I don't know. And I wonder if some of this gets in the realm of concepts beyond human comprehension, including the notion of free will, because the question arises, who is the entity? Who or what is the entity that has free will? Because if there is me that feels like Mark, but I think there's also some kind of intelligence beyond this feeling of Mark, which entity are we speaking about that has free will? And maybe at the level of the, if you want to call it the one mind, the singular field of consciousness, God, if that's all there is, then it would make sense that the free will arises out of that entity. And then the question becomes to me, what is our interaction as a piece of that, but not in this level of perception, acting as the whole of that consciousness? And I wonder what the interplay is. And then the last thing I'll say is I've become more and more interested in things like astrology and human design. I've been interested in that for several years, but especially after going down the cosmology rabbit hole, it makes me look at the lights in the sky very differently. And I wonder what effect they're having on the world and whether they are conscious in some way or they exert an energy. And it would seem that if we're born at a certain place in time where the stars are aligned a certain way, it would make sense that the energies are a certain way then, which would predetermine or at least make certain events more likely for that person.
Mm-hmm.
So I got to riff a little bit on what you brought up here, Topher. Yeah. And I'll just go backwards through what Mark said. The free will question is huge. I often think that despite all of his issues, the often quoted statement from Aleister Crowley of, let thy will be done was really a magical statement referring to your higher self-will, or that one mind that all other lesser minds are enmeshed within, or I don't want to say particles of, but so more like, a fractal dimension of scale smaller, but yet also resonant with the whole, right? So my point here is that maybe the free will really comes about from having that spiritual essence be the director of your life, where it's not so much that you're doing things or controlling things, you're letting them happen through you without creating excess pain through resistance. So in that sense, when you're following the lead of the great conductor or orchestrator of this entire cosmic soup, then you're acting in pure freedom and with pure free will. But there's like a paradox to it where it's not your will with your little s self, but it's the big S self, that will, right? So it's like, this is like a resolution of the paradox of free will versus determinism or fate. And I think that that's where all truths need to somehow converge, these paradoxical essences. I'll give some biofield examples of this. So I had a recent client who needed to do some work to improve digestion problems. I'll just put it that simply. And we were able to track down the issue to basically trust problems between himself and his mother. Because symbolically, when you understand symptoms as symbols, symbolically, the mother aligns with the symbolism of nourishment, especially when one is very young as a baby. But that continues to be aligned more strongly for some people than others. And in this individual's case, there was a particular event where, as a teenager, he had this desire to go to summer school to make up for lost credits that he didn't get in high school because of his mom moving him around a lot. This is part of like the interruption and violation trust issues that he had built up with her. And she decided he should go visit his father in Guatemala. And he tells his mother, I'll go for 2 weeks, but then I got to get back here for summer school. So I can't go for longer. Well, he goes to Guatemala, but when he gets to the plane, surprise, they booked him a month-long trip. So he's going to miss his summer school. So he's had his trust and his free will violated in a pretty extreme way by this. And while he's down there as like a teenager, he experiences being basically like forced upon by an older woman and loses his virginity. So this is what I'm trying to point out here, is that we have this dynamic disequilibrium between yin and yang, masculine and feminine, on a huge cosmic scale that filters down into our life, represented by our relationship, whether if we're men, then our relationship to prominent women in our life, mothers, girlfriends, wives, etc., daughters, or, you know, the opposite for women towards men, that each person of the opposite gender represents your belief or perspective relative to that cosmic force of yin or yang. And so this guy's relationship to the yin energy was that it would violate him and, you know, do things against his will to him. So then when he's on this trip where he's really deep in the unknown in another country, where the boundaries of what is and isn't possible have become much more blurry because there's so much unfamiliarity, that's when this shadow yin energy can come through and, you know, cause this violation of free will in a major way. And that led to a lot of stuck energy. But essentially the digestion problem was related to that, the not trusting the source of nourishment. And it's just one session, his digestion got a lot better. But I want to point out, you talked about these, I would call them canon events, things that nobody seemed to choose, like 9/11 and lockdowns, that in the human biofield, those type of events show up the same way that if you were to look at a forest that had been cleared and check out all the tree stumps, you'd be able to point out, based on scorching in the rings of the tree stumps, what year some kind of big forest fire came through, right? Like people's biofields have this scratch in the record that marks these particular big traumatic events. Most people will have that show up in some way. But what's interesting is the way that those dark nights of the soul for the collective show up are individuated to the person's own relationship to, you know, that perceived opposite force of yin or yang. So like this person that I'm telling the story about, when I hit his when I hit that sort of energetic scar of lockdowns, I immediately was like, zing. The biggest problem for him in lockdowns was his mom. That is, his mom was the most gung-ho believer of all of the propaganda that he was most resistant between and trying to convince and having conflict over. And I said that it was like, absolutely, that was the case. And there was like a lot of, issue around that. So I don't know exactly where I'm leading us to question wise, but I'm sure I've sparked something.
Well, like it is a massive thing to actually consider these outlier events. In college, I was a econ finance guy, so a little bit in your fold, Mark. And like when you get to like the 400 and 500 level classes with that, it's pretty amazing how statistics play out with things. And statistically, and just looking at my own life, also outlier events absolutely have shaped my life. And I've have a 20-year essay that I've been writing about surprises. I call it On Surprises. It's like going to be the first thing I release on my Substack page. And the whole thing is even if I think I have control, even if I think I'm the one who's doing it, I'm the doer, which my personal spiritual, I guess you would say, mentor, for a very long time, Ramana Maharshi would say, he goes, there's only one problem, and that problem is identification. And so what he was talking about in that particular instance was the identification with you as the doer, you as the one who's doing it. And it's amazing. It is absolutely amazing to watch how many times when I trace a thought or I trace an action or I trace anything back, the witnessing awareness that's aware of all these things is actually free of whatever that so-called stimulus is. The stimulus, the whatever's out there, the action, the activity, that's the superfluous. That's the aspect of self that is the temporal. But the witnesser, the sponsoring awareness is that eternal spark that goes on and on and on. And I don't know why God would put us in a mechanism that would actually constantly be deconstructing temporal idols. Maybe it's so because maybe at some point in a higher realm or dimension, our higher self like chose to go, hey, it'd be really good to kind of forget and to feel limits and feel all these things. And God's like, okay, that's what you want. Here you go. You get to feel limits. You get to feel boundaries or whatever it is. I don't know that aspect of things. But in this particular realm, it is so obvious nobody has their hands on the reins. Like when I talk to the absolute most control freaks, and I'll ask them these questions about surprises, and I'll ask them these questions about control. What do they really control? If they're intellectually honest, they all come to the same conclusion. Like, oh, well, if they have a semblance of awareness, they're like, oh, yeah, I really didn't. Oh, that's just happening.
The last conspiracy theory you ever need is nobody's in charge. Everything's going to be fine.
Right.
I say that all the time.
Yeah, I love that. I love your messiah. Like, I love that whole action because there is a lot of truth to that. To even say that, like, to even make that projection that there's an outside arbiter, that's going to that's going to absolve you of your wrongdoings is saying that you're the one that's doing the wrongdoings to begin with. Like, it's amazing. So that's where I'm at with things. I'm consistently being humbled by, what God presents in front of me. Like there's no like master of destiny. And like when I'm actually in front of people that feel like they're masters of destiny, that they really have that strong persona, like they're the ones that know, they're the knower. My God, on an internal level, like they're so twisted up is the best way to say. Like they're not coming from a place of joy or gratitude, usually.
I have a few comments. First is that it feels like, regardless of events occurring around us, that we have an ability to control our reaction subjectively. And I don't even know if that's true, but it feels that way. Where the event, we can't control maybe the way the weather's going to be tomorrow. It's just going to be that way. We can decide whether we're going to be upset about it or not. This notion of surrendering, basically, which is what I was hearing you describe, Topher, in various ways of basically allowing things to unfold. That's been a big part of my personal journey, because I have traditionally been a big planner, and then leaving my job without really knowing what would be next has been quite the exercise in surrender, to just see what unfolds around me and then respond accordingly. And it's led to various creative projects primarily so far. And now I'm in one of those states again, where the latest book came out a few months ago, and Into the Upside Down Cosmos. I'm not sure what's next. I don't have the next creative insight. There are many other big question marks, but what I found is that things eventually do come into one's field. I also wonder if there are truly generalizable pieces of advice to give on how to surrender, and what the trade-off is between being totally passive and being active. And the concepts in human design have raised some questions for me. So if your audience isn't familiar, human design is basically a combination of astrology and a few other modalities that give guidance about your tendencies, sort of like astrology. But there are different prototypes in human design. For example, one is a generator, and one of the core elements is waiting to respond, more so than perhaps a manifester, which is going to be the person to stimulate things. So maybe each person has a little bit different way of responding to the world and surrendering. One more idea that came to mind when you were speaking, Topher, is the teachings of Dr. David Hawkins. And he was a top psychiatrist in New York, and then left the world, meditated for years, had all sorts of spiritual awakenings that he eventually wrote about, came back into society and wrote these 9 books and became like a guru of his own. Passed away, I believe, in 2012 or 2013. But he speaks of this ego dissolution process, which was absolutely terrifying. But after it happened, he would walk around in the world and he would say it was the body, the arm, and it would almost function autonomously. He concluded that we are karmic wind-up toys let loose. And he was able to function perfectly, even though he didn't feel like he was the one functioning.
That's awesome. It's very... can I just elaborate on that real quick, Chance? It's really funny because I do body work, and this sounds very, very weird even to me. I don't know why this works. But when I'm working on somebody, and let's say I find a part of the body that, is stuck for whatever reason, when I actually address it as it, as they say in the Bible, like we're here to name things. Like when I name, the longissimus muscle in the back, I'm like, okay, longissimus, I can feel, and I name it, it rectifies. And you would think, like, in consciousness, that's just like me making something up, or at some point a person came up with this particular name in Latin, then Greek, or whatever, and then I'm, at the last iteration of that, saying it in English. Like, how does this even work in consciousness? But without fail, if I go ahead and name it and recognize it as it is, as its name, and then I go into neutral center, it always rectifies. And I have that mechanism is so true. Like you just name it. And I used to do this in Raja Yoga. One of the clearing pathways was to actually name whatever the thought pattern was, or like say you had a trauma in the story, whatever the narrative around that trauma was, you would actually name the whole thing. Like you would call it like a movie name, and then you would actually have a dialogue with that narrative as if it was its own thing. And it would resolve. And you could do that with other people. Like, say you had a narrative with somebody that you hadn't seen for a long time. You could literally make that narrative into a thing, see the full story arc of it, totally like make it more solid than what it's just like, you know, just the annoyance that's felt in your system. You go into that and then you resolve it. You come into resolution with it, and then you would find like the dealing with that person now was so much easier. And there's just something about naming things and seeing it as its own discrete entity that has some effect on us in consciousness.
Yeah, this is great to riff on here. And I think I can even segue this back to physics a little bit. So here I go. The naming of a thing brings it from the unconscious to the conscious, first of all. I mean, I see this, again, back to biofield tuning all the time, where a big factor in rectifying trauma is to have them understand, to say it out loud, exactly what it was, and also like the secret belief that they formed around the event. That's the most important thing. I have a great example of this actually, where I had a client that was referred to me. So this was somebody coming in fresh without really any like knowledge of me or expectations about the process. So it's always good when you find something specific right away in their energy field so that there's like a trust buildup. But the thing I found right away was a teenage injury to his left leg, somewhere between the knee and the hip. And I talked about how this injury created a relationship with pain where it was basically like, I can't not have pain, was the way that I described it. And he told me that he had this injury from sports in high school. And then after that injury, he formed this personal code that basically said, I must have suffering in order to grow and to succeed. That I have to have it. I can't not have it, was essentially the belief that formed out of that. And the guy was not like in bad shape per se, but he had something going on in his nervous system energetically that when I see older people that have had this going on for a long period of time, it starts to manifest into a lot of severe symptoms deriving from what you could call like hypersensitivity. Because at a certain point, the charge that builds up in the nervous system is too much and it can't take on anymore. So back to this idea of being karmic wind-up toys, or like a spring being compressed, how a lot of people currently function in life with this fight or flight energy is that they've actually adapted towards using it as their primary fuel source. And like, that's what was going on with this individual that I'm talking about. And what came to me during the session was like sometimes lately, since I've had the honor of being taught by many herbalists on the show, but especially our great Kyle Denton at Tippecanoe Herbs, Interverse coupon code 10% off. He's wearing the shirt. He's wearing the Tippecanoe shirt right now. Well, I learned about passion flower from him during our Libra Astro Herbalism series. And passion flower has this fascinating signature to it that relates it to the idea of Christ on the cross, that there's these 5 stems on the flower that are supposed to pertain to the 5 wounds of Christ. And this event was like the point where through suffering, it was a required suffering for humanity to grow or evolve. That's the mythology here. And in the context of like herbalism or homeopathy, there's this idea that applying that which resonates with the symptom is the cure, right? So for this individual, hypermasculine, like don't need rest, don't need sleep, don't need healing, just go, go, go. I prescribed taking a bath in passion flower petals actually, because this would be like a homeopathic or herbal tea that he would be able to discharge some of this charged nervous system thing going on. What I want people to understand is like, if you're running around feeling at the same time tired, but also wired, you might be drawing on stress as your energetic reservoir rather than rest. And in fact, rest and stress are anagrams for each other. So there's like some weird subconscious precedent for this that we've all been aware of for our whole life. I mean, this guy I was working with had like a stress tank on the left side of his abdomen that was his main battery. And that was how he was operating, strictly from this. So to get back to the idea of like physics and how, I heard Topher talking about this more than once, how like magnetism, how magnets are made, that metal is basically traumatized to hold a certain kind of energy and then directed in a certain orientation. I think to really decondition ourselves from karma requires for us to let the tension in our springs release. And that's like the idea of the surrender. And it's not that we, paradoxically, coming back to paradoxes, it's not that we go into a state of non-action or non-activity, but that we try to find a stillness, equilibrium, a rest point within ourselves and within our behavior, like allowing ourselves to have full rest and operate with that as our energetic fulcrum rather than stress as the battery. If all this hopefully helps somebody out there, like at the very least, maybe they go get some passion flower tincture or take a herbal bath. But, getting ourselves like this step one to resolving karma is actually the body. Like Michael Tessarion says, the body is the shadow, and the real shadow work means working with the body. So if we can get our body out of this fight or flight dependency, then the spiritual components will flow on from that. And it doesn't even necessarily require any kind of like specialized teaching or mystical knowledge. It's like, you get your body good and your life will just begin flowing with the good more readily. And you'll just be present and witness to that flow as it's given to you. It's not like something you have to attain to or, initiate into. It's kind of a process that we're all promised as long as our wings aren't clipped. But yeah, I wanted to maybe segue that into, you guys can riff on magnets or what I just said, whatever's cool.
I have a thought and then I'll let you go, Topher. Yeah. What you said, Chance, brings me to questions about free will. So who or what is choosing in this apparent decision to heal and work through those challenges? Or is it just all happening autonomously? And this is part of the challenge, and that we live in a place where people are going to be going through struggles and they have healers who guide them, and it's just all part of the design. And then I had another point that I can't remember. Oh, what I was thinking as you were speaking, Chance, was that you're talking about very fundamental things about how to approach life, basically, and how to approach struggles and suffering and pain. And the way you described it is not what we're taught in the mainstream world at all about how we deal with things. And this goes to a question that I keep coming to. Why is it that basic fundamental truths we're not taught? Why is it that we have to dig to just understand basic things about how to live life and what this place is?
I think it's because we're in the Kali Yuga. I mean, to answer that, like, just when I read the Puranas, I was floored because everything that the Puranas said that the Kali Yuga would be, it is. And one of the big things that it says is everything of importance. This was the key delineation. Everything of importance would be inverted in the Kali Yuga. And the secondary thing was everything in the mundane world would be gamified. Everything would become a gamble. And I mean, it's amazing. I was just on a flight on Sunday and everybody around me was on their phones, either gambling or in a game, like they were doing a game. Like it was like, and I was just seeing.
And the games are all based on code underneath the hood that deals with about 1 million different random number generator, like basically digital dice rolls constantly, invisibly.
Yeah. And it's so incredible.
That's the reign of quantity. It's quantity.
Exactly. And by the way, Chance, I love that stream was epic. Because that's something my dad used to say to me all the time when I was coming up, was he was like, it's about quality, not quantity. Like, and I really have tried to live my life that way. I'm not out there trying to get all the quantity, but I want really, really high quality of life. And so I'm with you on that. And the this notion of inversion, which is what we're here to talk about, it's massive, because like it's something all of us have spoken about. I mean, if it's worth knowing, we've been lied to about it, and we've been lied to about it with a lot of money behind the lies. It's not just like some schmuck coming up to you and lying to you. It's like there's a whole sales force behind the lie. There's like if we're to talk about tulpas, and we're to talk about thought forms as things, there is a humongous investment in having us disempower ourselves by believing the inversions. Because if you look at it, like when I'm working on somebody, a lot of the ways an inversion will show up in somebody's speech pattern is they'll contradict themselves. And without fail, the clients that I have that have tons of contradictions, their auric field, like their actual, and Chance, I would like to hear you comment on this if you've experienced this. But say somebody's running a ton of lies or a ton of contradictions, just say that they believe a lot of contradictions. Their auric field, their presence is very, very small relative to those.
The more severe the cognitive dissonance or the contradiction is, it actually manifests physical problems. One of my
Right.
favorite examples, just to toss it out there, I once worked with a guy who had like chronic knee injuries. It was either knee or ankle, one of those two things. I think it was actually the right ankle, to be specific, because that's where the indecisiveness energy is at. So that was kind of resonant to this issue. But he had simultaneously the belief in his right ankle that he had to be perfect in everything he did, but then also this embedding of the story of Job from the Bible that he received as a kid and internalized really hard about, if you're too perfect, you'll be punished. So like he was running these two things simultaneously. I have to be perfect, but I can't be too perfect or I'll be punished. And so his right ankle just kept never would heal from this contradiction until he identified that. And then that was it. It was no longer a chronic injury.
Right. So getting back to like the inversion of these tulpas have a huge amount of investment in them. And that investment implies intent. There's very strong intent behind us believing these inversions in this disempowerment. This, I could just say social engineering for the most part is just a disempowerment campaign. That's all it is. It's just there to get you to choose the most undignified route possible. And then when you choose the most undignified route possible, this then gets back to like the Christian ideal of, the shaitan, the Satan, of being that which is the enemy of humanity, So like there's so many overlaps that I can see between like, the ancient Hindu cosmology talking about how in the Kali Yuga, there's incredible inversion of anything that's important. Everything is gamified pretty much, because the way I deduced it when I was really studying it was that there was just a lack of energy. There was just not enough energy. And this will get back into like Chance, what we were talking about with Norberto Keppe and the disinverted physics.
Yeah, I want that gravy.
Yeah. Like when the energy, let's just say capacitance drops to a certain level, there can only be like X amount of expression, right? Like if the capacitance is really high, then you might have like the Z, expression. But like as the valences, essentially concentrate, because it's very much like winter time. in wintertime, you don't have as much solar gain. So everything is concentrating, and the outward expression of the energy isn't so much, right? Even in the thermal aspect of things. And so there's just less and less life that's going on. And then as spring comes forward and all the rest of it, I mean, you guys know the analogy. There's more thermal energy, there's more solar energy, there's more all this. And so you have this greater and greater expression. So I'm of the mind that, this being the Kali Yuga, it's natural. I don't think any of us are victims. I'm not sitting here and go, oh, woe is me. I mean, we're living the Chinese proverb, may we live in interesting times. And that is definitely a thing. Nothing is boring. But then again, this is like one of these greater things, going back to the question of free will, and going back into the question of like actual choice. Did any of us actually choose to come into the time that we're in as we are? I don't have any, pre-life or what is it called? Reincarnation memories. So that's not something I can really speak of. I have had near-death experiences. And so in that extended, consciousness realm, I didn't have like insight into any other lives. So I don't really know. I think that's
doesn't free will kind of prove itself by the fact that your perspective on whether or not you chose to be here is a belief that's chosen?
Not necessarily. No, that doesn't prove it. That doesn't prove itself that way.
Okay. It maybe evidences itself. I don't know, but I find that to be fascinating part of the deal. Like you get to choose whether or not you chose to be here in a sense, because it's a belief. It's not a provable. It's an unprovable abstraction. It's a philosophical ground, they would call it.
Can you state it in a different way? Because the way that you're stating it, I might not be understanding it.
Well, just that with any like cosmology, there's a ground, they call it, and you have to choose your ground. You can never get behind it, right? Like for the materialist, it's the Big Bang, but that requires a leap of faith of some abstract existence of a singular point of matter that would have been unknowable in what preceded it. It's no different than the philosophical ground of saying God. And it's the same type of question of
grant me one miracle.
Yeah. It's the same kind of question of whether or not you think that you chose to be here or you're here against your will, whether or not this is a good place for your benefit or like a enslavement experience. And like the fact that you have to choose a ground in your perspective, and perspective is one of the things that is, belief and perspective is one of the things that, if anything, seems to be a free will aspect of being here, even if nothing else was. You see where I'm going with this? Like, that's how I feel about it.
I'll comment a bit on this notion of pre-birth planning. It's something I've looked into to the extent that one can in terms of people's anecdotal accounts. There's a book called Your Soul's Plan by Robert Schwartz, and there's some subsequent books he's written where he would interview a person's soul using different mediums, basically, and ask that person's soul through the mediums whether or not the person planned the life challenges, and if so, why. And these are people who often have gone through horrific things, and he categorizes them. So like the worst things people could go through, he finds a person who's been through that and then interviews the soul through a medium to see if it was planned. And the basic answer is that their soul planned it before birth, and it was ultimately to get them to a place of self-love. We also hear in near-death experiences, there is the implication that there was some plan before birth, and there was something the soul came there to do. So in my podcast series, Where is My Mind? I interviewed some people who've had near-death experiences. And one woman, Barbara Bartolome, she told me that she basically couldn't remember why she was here, but when she was in the near-death state, she knew it. So she knew that she knew it at one point, but couldn't remember what it was. And this is a common theme, like there's an amnesia. Also, the University of Virginia has studied children with past life memories, over 2,500 cases. And in a percentage of those cases, the children also report intermission memories, a time between lives, including choosing parents. So there are also people under hypnosis that have recalled this. That's probably less reliable. I've come across cases of spontaneous memories where people talk about a pre-birth planning session, basically, and they had different lives that they were presented with, and the different challenges they would have if they were born to different parents. All of this is probably very difficult to verify, although sometimes the children had memories of what their parents were doing before they were born. So that's pretty interesting that the children can recall those things. All this to say is that let's just say there's some reality to this. Then the question becomes, who or what was doing the choosing, even at that level of the soul? And were they choosing based on informed consent, let's say, or was there any trickery involved? And I know there's momentum these days to talk about the notion of a soul trap, and that we get our memories wiped, and that if we do decide to come into a new life, maybe we were coerced into doing so. I don't really know what's true with that, or how we could verify, and whether it applies to every single person. But I just throw all that out there. And then I want to comment one more thing on Topher's comments earlier before I pause. I'm reminded of Joel Schaefer's work. He's a Toltec shaman, and he speaks about what the Toltecs believe about this world. And the idea is that there is a parasitic force that somehow got here. And if we actually do not inherently feel fear, when we feel fear, it's the parasitic force's fear that we're feeling through our bodies. And then many of our thoughts are actually the parasitic force's thoughts. So there is this entity that is constantly trying to mess with us under the Toltec cosmology.
Yeah, I'm friends with Joel, and he and I have shared many a note on these types of things. So I've interviewed Jerry Marzinski. I think you have too, Chance. I'm not sure if you have or not.
Never quite got it lined up.
Yeah, and that's something I've had to deal with, because I've dealt with clients where they've had walk-ins, and I've dealt with one actual, I guess you would call it a possession. I'm not Catholic, so I don't know the difference between all the different things. But yeah, there's definitely extracurricular energies that will go into entities that have chose to be vacuous. When it comes to choosing parents and choosing this and choosing that, I think it's much more musical. I think it's much, much, much more of a harmonic.
Read this comment. Slick says, soul contract theory is paper terrorism. Any here before or hereafter that resembles bureaucracy is a worthy foe. I'm going to get to heaven and fire my agent.
Good one, Slick. That's awesome. Yeah, I'm kind of the mind that we don't have all the information, and God actually can do a much better job at distributing where he wants his beings for their best interest. Because I'm a believer that God, the creator, that which created us, I do believe that we do have a beginning, middle, and end. As a created entity, we have a start. That's the best way I could say it. And that start, we didn't start ourselves.
But isn't that a temporal system?
Precisely. This is
like,
the crux
wouldn't
of
you,
it.
if you transcended the temporal, wouldn't you be in an eternal state? So there wouldn't be a beginning?
So this is the thing, the awareness that is the awareness that's getting to have all the fun, and, let's just say that which is the continuity. Okay. You could call it soul or whatever. I'm of the mind that that is eternal, but that's not making choices. That's not the aspect of self that makes choices.
So I had an interesting experience on, I'm sorry, you're not done.
Well, the flow is cut. I forgot what I was going to say.
I'm sorry.
No worries.
Did you really? Buddy, I had this, so I haven't told this story, but it was so profound, where I'd had a couple interviews on subject matter of both shamanism and Western esotericism. And the idea was really kicking around in my mind that we receive our initiations in the dream realm, that something, and I've had a lot of guests even before this recent stint of shows that I had recorded where they had these type of initiations, like Jason Quitt comes to mind, where he had these masters in his dreams teach him basically qigong movements for health and taking in energy. And I was thinking about this idea of receiving dream initiations in context with the idea, pondering about the idea of the forgetting your life when you die and whether or not that's a good or bad thing. And for example, a lot of traditions are revolving around the attempt to recover your past life memories in some way. And in particular, an individual I was researching and doing an interview to talk about his Hermeticism, and it's a show that's coming out later this month. The guy actually got messed up, in my opinion, by what he was told was his past life. That he got this story of a past life and these transgressions he allegedly did, and his attempt to basically rectify the bad karma of this past life just wrecked his current life. And he accepted it and was asking for it because he thought that's what he had to do to balance the scale of what he did in the previous life. So I'm thinking about all this. I go to bed after talking about this particular guy's story. And in that night in my dream, I had one of the most vivid and lucid dreams I can ever recall, where I had died and I'd been reborn into a family that knew my previous family. And so I knew, and I had retained my memories. So I'm like a baby and I'm around my actual family in this life, my wife, my daughter, my mom and dad, and the absolute agony I felt in that dream from knowing who I was before and not being able to be my previous self and like missing that connection to my family and all the things I felt like I was going to miss out on. I woke up. I don't think I've ever woke up from a dream and been sleeping. Yeah, I'm sorry for the taco tofu. Never woke up from a dream and been weeping. I was weeping. My wife witnessed it. So that's, to me, that was my dream initiation that informed me on the topic. I was asking for information about this topic. I got to have an experiential visionary state that showed me exactly why things were configured the way they were. And I felt that it was an acceptable answer for me, that it's like, it's for our own good, until a certain point that we might be more ready, that we get that memory wipe.
I like with a bunch of my clients, if they have some really good 12th house transits, I tell them flat out, commune with your dream state, like just go in there and either have a dream journal or, I mean, there's some of my clients that literally they'll have 4 or 5 aspects going on in the 12th house. And I'm like, you shouldn't be talking to anybody in your conscious mind. Like if you need guidance, go straight to the dream realm, go into the liminal spaces, and there your answers will be. And for a lot of people that have guilt about that kind of relieves them of that guilt.
So a thought on past lives. Some of the cases that the University of Virginia has studied involve birthmarks and physical deformities. So actual biological traits that can be linked to medical records. The researchers say, yeah, there was a person that died in this exact way, and that's why you have this strange feature, or it at least correlates with it. And these are little kids talking about how they died in bizarre ways. And we've got a medical record verifying it that does lend some credence possibly to that. I don't know, that person's was tapped in to some previous life. So I think it's all very complex. And it leads me to my next point, which is when I hear people who have been in altered states, whether it's through like 5-MeO DMT or a near-death experience or any spiritually transformative experience, often one of the common features is ineffability, meaning that they cannot use language to describe what happened adequately. And then those of us who haven't had those experiences could easily become confused. So for example, there's a big debate in the near-death experience literature about whether near-death experiences are caused by chemicals, like maybe DMTs released in the brain or something like that. But researchers have looked at this and they found that there are distinct aspects of the near-death experience that they don't find in any psychedelic compound. Even though there might be some overlap, the near-death experience is very unique. And there are people who've had near-death experiences and have also done DMT, and they'll say these are different. But they might sound very similar because they're trying to use words with our limited language. And I feel like that disconnect between trying to bring experience into the physical with limited language and try to describe things that are maybe indescribable is causing problems.
And it's kind of a symptom of quantitative thinking to even be attempting to link all this to neurotransmitters or particles of any kind, which seems should be kind of thrown out based on the fact that there's no brain activity during NDEs to be recording information to begin with.
Yeah, in I have to say, as somebody that has had that, my own direct experience with that, my best friend had it also. There's something that most times when I come across a person that has had that, we all have a very weird psychic link, and almost all of us don't have any fear of death, which is kind of it's kind of interesting how that works. Is like there's an underlying tension that a lot of people have that they don't admit, that they're extremely scared of two things. One is being alone, and the second is death. And what's amazing about when you quote unquote die, or when the body, stops, whatever, is that on that other side, you're not alone, and all you feel is like absolute love and ease. Like when I say love, it's not romantic love. It's just like you're wholly enveloped in utter care. Like there isn't any distortion or fear that's in the space at all. There's no pain. It's just you're in total care. And so when that's going on, that's why I have the projection that God is benevolent. And that's why I also have the projection that I don't think we choose where we go or do soul contracts or any of that. Because in all honesty, we don't know what's best for us. I mean, think about how many times in your life you thought, oh, I'm going to do this because this is what's good for me. This is what's best for me. And it doesn't happen. And then something else happens that you never would have thought of, or it might have been 180 degrees from what you thought you needed. And it ended up being so much better for you in the long run than what your original choice would be. I really think God is constantly really this benevolent caretaker and wants the best for us. And is just constantly just trying to get this shaman was saying, trying to any way possible, just remove the negative thought patterns or the distortions that are out there that are lowering our valence of energy. That's the best way I could see it.
There's a phenomenon in psychology known as affective forecasting errors, where people are systematically terrible at predicting the things that they think they will like or dislike. So when you ask them, how happy will you be when you get this, or how upset will you be when this horrible tragedy happens, they basically neglect the fact that their psychology adjusts in ways they don't know will be there. And this to me raises big questions about the whole field of manifesting, because how can we really, if we don't know what we are going to like or dislike, how can we try to manifest something that we're not sure of? So David Hawkins will always say, manifest the feeling if you want love, because you can experience that now and you know you like that, then just go for the feeling without a specific outcome.
It's interesting. I wonder if what people sometimes think of as manifesting is actually more of a premonition than a control. Because,
Sometimes.
with my wife and our daughter, whenever I met her from a distance, because she's from Canada, I had this strong sense where I wasn't sure if I was praying for it or trying to force it to happen, or if I was just aware that it was going to happen, that we were going to have children together, and I kind of treated it like I was asking for it, but it was almost more like I was just affirming that that it was right. So maybe there's something to that. Maybe manifestation is just misunderstood premonition. And that's why The Secret doesn't really work the way that it's advertised.
Yeah, I've told you this, Chance. I've started writing 2 different books that I was writing as fictional books. Like I was writing them, and the vibration that I dropped into in both times was I wanted to be novel. Like I literally was telling my consciousness, I don't want the same old, same old. I don't want the hero's journey trope and blah 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 blah. Like I really wanted something to be so pure and so novel as to keep my attention captivated. And in writing those books, I ended up finding out that whatever that vibration that I thought was being novel wasn't what I thought it was. It was actually showing me what is actually real, even though I thought it was my imagination. Like that's what I was interpreting it as. So to your point, like where people are saying, I'm a manifester, Mark, I was a professional human designer for 10 years. So I really had to deal a lot in the new age world of like, and me as a egoic manifester in that world, like I was like King Dingaling. But like with that energy of manifestation, I think you're right, Chance. It's much more of the eschaton. I think it's much more of the finish line is already done. God knows where you're going to end up, and you get a glimpse of that, thinking that oh, I manifested that. And that's why when I hear people talk about, soul contracts, and I'm going to choose this person for this amount of time, and I'm going to choose them, I'm like, no, that's a misinterpretation of the data. That's not what's happening. You're getting a glimpse into the eschaton, or you're getting a glimpse into what has been preordained. And because you get a glimpse, as Ramana Maharshi would say, the only problem is identification. Like you're like, oh, I created that. No, you didn't create it. That's not what happened at all. It was preordained. It was going to happen whether you wanted it to happen or not. It was happening.
Well, you reminded me of a story, Topher, that was in Your Soul's Plan. I read this years ago, so I hope I'm getting it right. But a woman, she claims, I guess the mediums claim that she had agreed to come into a life where she was going to end up with breast cancer. And the breast cancer was related to her self-image, basically. And she had a choice each time she got breast cancer as to whether or not she was going to change the way she viewed herself and the way she viewed life. And when she didn't change, she would get breast cancer again. So there was this sense of predetermination and also choice together.
Yeah, I think I'm a bothist about this stuff. I think it may even be that part of the pendulum swing between the temporal and the eternal is that the temporal is where you're making the wrong choice, essentially. That you have the free will to make the right or the wrong choice. And the further you go into what's not true, like what makes it right or wrong is based on the truth of who you are and how you align with the generative power that we call the divine mind or God, right? And so you're on the hamster wheel of the temporal slave wheel of time experience, and there's a compression effect that occurs while you're there that is probably a compression effect of time, I should say, as in it feels like there's less of it and it's speeding up based on your desire. In that, when you're in that state, you're in this quantitative mindset of like, I need more time. I never have enough time. I need more money. I never have enough money. I need more stuff, whatever the case may be. And the time compression comes in that basically hastens your end, your inevitable end, and reinsertion into the game, you could call it, as probably like a mercy kill. And then like when you are when you're in the qualitative life, you feel this expansion of time. Like you always have enough, like a day lasts longer. You know, my life now versus when I was like 29, working a normal job, 9 to 5, 5 days a week. Even though I'm older, I feel like time has slowed down. Like the days are longer than they were back then. And it has to do, I think, with being in alignment with more truth. And, there was another thing your dude, Cesar, said in that excellent episode of your podcast about, what was the name of that episode? You'll let me know. There was a banger title to it. Do you remember? It was like matter is consequence or something like that. Right. So he was talking about this exact thing, which I found fascinating about, like, he put it in the terms of vibration, but that if we want to call it vibration, improving or speeding up or being more harmonically resonant with the truth, that time will slow down or stop even. And having had a few time stop experiences in my life, like someone hit the pause button and my environment went on a loop as long as I wanted it to be there. And I didn't know how I did it, but I knew how to get back out of it. Like there is something to that. And I think that could be what's on the other side of the caluga, is like a collective stop moment where like the wheel just stops and we get out of the time bound experience for, and go back to an undefined experience for as long as we want that to be. And then at which point the length of time of cycles becomes kind of irrelevant, because it's like we're there until we metaphorically bite the apple again, right?
Yeah, the whole notion of time intrigues me because in many ways it's illusory. We actually can't verify anything other than the present moment. The past is memory in the present moment. But even if we do assume that sequence is correct, people can literally experience time so differently, like you're describing, Chance, but also more dramatic examples. When someone has a near-death experience and also has a life review during that period, they might relive their whole life in what in our time is a few minutes.
Right.
So what is going on? How is it that time's experienced differently like that?
Or people that get abducted by the fairies. The Rip Van Winkle effect. They feel like they were gone a day and they come back and it's been 2 years. I mean, there's lots of that in the contact literature, which
yes,
I'm largely skeptical of a lot of the contact literature, but I don't doubt that there are some experiencers out there. So at which point it becomes important to recognize that even time is not a quantitative thing.
Right.
Like what part of the issue of the inversion of quantitative thinking is that we mistake the thing for what we measure it by. So when we think of time, we think of it as like 1 hour, 1 day, 1 year, whatever. But that's actually just the yardstick. But what we're actually measuring is something that has a specific quality to it. So like, what was the quality of the year 2020? That's the only thing that has a reality to it. Whereas the measuring stick is more of an abstraction. The same goes for space too. It's like, a foot or a mile north of me is not the same as a mile south of me, which means there's some kind of quality aspect to north and south, but not the 1 mile part. The 1 mile is not the quality. It's just the measurement. Does that all make sense?
It makes total sense. Oh,
You go ahead, Dober.
Yeah, I mean, that was the big thing with Wilhelm Reich and Victor Schauberger with their physics, was they were trying to increase bions or qualigens. And these were, for lack of a better term, these were like particulates or field effects that increased the potentiation of whatever was within that field.
It's like an orgone idea.
Yeah, orgone was a notion of these bions
Do you think they were
where
off on the particle aspect of this concept?
I don't know. I think there is a quality to hydrogen, like when um, hydrogen seems to the first iteration of hydrogen, or let's just say when plasma is converting itself into matter, instead of being like so hard fast to call it hydrogen. But let's say when the etheric is making itself more uh, inertial, more material, there's a phase that it goes through, in that very primordial phase of that, when it switches over from plasma into matter, as far as we can tell, is the most life-giving energetic force that we know of. And this is measured as orgone. Like they call it protium. It's light hydrogen. And this is a theory of mine. I haven't been able to prove it because I don't have the devices to prove it. But I do have the devices that actually create quote unquote orgone. And essentially all it's doing is making water really happy. And when you make water extremely happy by essentially biomimicking ideal conditions for it, the water itself will change its own quality, its viscosity. It will change its color, its taste. It does all these things. It's a very interactive thing, and it gives off a field that's felt. It's palpable, like it's qualitative. It's not quantitative. It's like, people's heart chakras will open. If a person has problem hearing, they're able to hear. If they have eyesight problems, they have the capacity to see better. There's all these things. So it's increasing the quality of the physical mechanisms. And then what's odd about these things is when you take that particular field and you put it around something mechanical, it will increase the quality or the efficiency of the mechanical things, which is like mind-blowing. And that's why, like, so many people, I think it's why it's dismissed, is because a lot of people are like, well, if it's working on a biological thing, it can't work on a non-biological thing. And that's just not true. So many of the physicists at the turn of the 20th century, they would talk about their consciousness being one of the qualitative drivers of the machines that they were running. And so that's something it's a very real thing. In the closest medium that I can see, I should say, I think it's a field effect. Personally, I think it's just like when you're reflecting to your environment that you are in harmony with it one way or another, that harmony begets more harmony. It begets a higher quality of expression. And I think that's what occurs with a lot of these things that are called orgone accumulators or active orgone generators.
So 2 comments. One is on vision. In near-death experiences, there are people who have been blind since birth in their body who can see in the near-death experience state.
That's cool.
So there's something about our physical biology that is a limiter, perhaps. And even people that can normally see in their body, they go into a near-death experience sometimes and describe 360-degree vision. So there is something that seems to be limited about our biology. But going back to Chance's discussion about time and space, this is actually something I learned from the philosopher Dr. Bernardo Kastrup. He says that time and space actually have circular definitions, so meaning they're meaningless. Time is the interval between 2 events, but what's an interval? It's the unit of time, basically. And space is the distance between 2 things, and space is getting into its distance. They're basically interchangeable. And it's one of the fundamental limitations of language when you get down to anything.
Oh, that's really good distinction to bring up. I'd actually like if there's more to be expanded on that about time and space as this sort of like circular concept. Because I have a few things I could add to that, but I would like to hear more if if you have more about that.
Sure. Well, Kastrup describes them as language ghosts. And they are abstractions if we can't actually define them. And then this brings me in my mind back to like Einstein's relativity and the way that we view all of physics and the cosmos, which is that things basically, Einstein's revision of gravity was that mass is attracting mass. So when you drop an apple to the ground, the mass of Earth is greater than the mass of the apple, so the apple falls downward. Einstein revised that to say that mass is altering space-time, bending and warping space-time, like if you put a medicine ball on a trampoline. But he's creating this abstraction, which we can't even define. And furthermore, one of the big reasons relativity even came about was because of a very specific interpretation of the 1887 Michelson-Morley study, where everyone said there was a null result. But if you actually look at it, there was a slight fringe shift. So there was a result. And also in their study in 1887, it was a foregone conclusion to them that Earth moves. So they said there was a null result and Earth moves. And they left the second part out because it was such a foregone conclusion. Therefore, we've disproven the ether. When in fact, you can explain the study very well by saying there was a stationary Earth and the fringe shift was indicative of an ether drift. And that led us to Einstein and this very abstract notion of space-time, which also brings us back to the notion of inversion, where reality got inverted a long time ago and we've just gone on with the presuppositions. And now we talk about space and time like they're real things.
Right.
So-
Because all the ether physicists, I mean, the last podcast I did, the big physics of the day, like the state of the art at the turn of the 20th century was standing columnar waves, which people will call scalar physics. And so in scalar physics, to get to your point, Mark, about space, there is no space. Like, this is what you're talking about, Chance, or not what you're talking about, but you actually remotely work on people. Like, how can you, waving a wand in your living room, do work 1,000 miles away if space in and of itself was, as we're told, it's like, there's a gap between two things, and then there's all these particles that are playing, billiard balls. That's utter bullshit. That's not what's actually happening. The inversion was intentional because when you get into the scalar domain, you have limitless capacitance, which means you have limitless energy. And the inversion in the Kali Yuga is such as like, no, we got to reduce the capacitance of everybody. We got to reduce the amount of energy that's available. We're working on a scarcity model. The scarcity model absolutely cannot work on engineering dynamics. The scarcity model has to work on mathematical abstractions, because actually in nature, we're always shown that there's endless amount. There's always resources. All the scarcity that's out there is just some sort of mathematical derivation. So the scalar domain would indicate that you can have, instantaneous action at a distance. And I know, Chance, you experience that in your profession, like probably like 10 times a week.
If I did that many sessions a week, well, you could say if it's multiple times in one session, then 10 or 12 times a week. Like the guy that I told the story of where I brought up hibiscus. I mean, the very first thing that happened when I put a tuning fork in his field is I could tell he had a significant injury between his knee and his hip of his left leg, and it was a thigh injury. And I said the exact age, but he never told me that up front. So, where does that information come from? Not only that, but that injury was significant to the mental block that he needed to resolve. Like, that was the injury that created the belief system out of it. So in the reign of quantity, what's interesting about the idea of time and space is Rene Guénon talks about the Kali Yuga being symptomatic of the solidification process, that as we're going further into the Kali Yuga, the world is becoming more, focused on the sensible and less on the essential, the inversion of the pole of essence versus matter, you could say. And part of that result is that the axis of time and space, you could say, are like they're sort of at odds with each other in this duality principle that is necessary for the type of scarcity model you're talking about, where individuation becomes a synonym for uniformity, which is very bizarre because everyone has this idea of being an individual means, you're unique. But in the Kali Yuga, individualism is actually expressed through uniformity. I'll just say, I'm just trying to make up a word, right? So like everyone acts like they're a unique special snowflake, but they're all living in a house that's similarly constructed, using technology that's identical to each other, eating from the same range of foods, doing the same type of general day, beginning to end. And as we go further into the solidification, that uniformity theoretically increases. And you could possibly say that the fact that uniform behavior is in some groups of people actually swinging the other direction a little bit, maybe a sign that we're lifting out of that part of the cycle potentially. But part of the time and space weave was that, as the solidification occurs, time compresses, as I've described how it happens in the person's singular life. And this compression is actually acting on space, where time is compressing space. So there's less unknown space. The world gets smaller, that whole feeling. And that at the flip point, at the point where the end of the world occurs, space actually throws the board over and, on time. And time is the thing that basically is like, temporarily abated, and space becomes more infinite again. So I would liken that symbolically to being as if all of a sudden the ice wall melted,
Right.
So there's a deluge event, right? And that's an end of the world type cycle. But at the same time, the world just grew a whole bunch. The space just got expanded because this container that's compressed it is no longer there. I'm not saying that that's exactly what happens, but that's where my mind goes when I'm describing Gwinon. And on the whole, like, duality of humanity, it's fascinating how he talks about the Cain and Abel story being actually esoterically about space and time. That you have the agrarian and you have the farmer and the nomad, essentially, right? You have one that raises animals and one that raises plants. And that the two, like, what humanity has going on are groups of people that are of this nomadic type. We know them. We know the type. They can't stay in one country for too long. They get kicked out of places. Just being in sedentary lifestyle in a sedentary community, they cause disruption and disintegration. It's just like intrinsically part of their nature. And then you have the opposite, like where if you displace sedentary people or agrarian people who are more space, like they would actually not work so well. So it's interesting in terms of time and space, how the sedentary lifestyle people, they come up with types of art or activities that reflect space being what matters. Like they work artistically in space with, like, say, architecture. They're filling a space with it. Whereas the nomadic peoples operate more on a time canvas. It's like poetry or music, where it's based on they're filling a time component, I guess is the way to put it. You got to read this Reign of Quantity book because I'm butchering it, but Mario totally laid all that out in our episode from 2 weeks ago. It's fascinating how the time and space question, like, shows up in humanity as these sort of dual impulses.
I mean, I could totally see that with when I was more of like a vagabonding person that was like traveling a lot internationally. I wasn't actually working in I guess you would say, in the spatial domain. Like, so even though I was moving through space, I was more collecting temporal events as my wealth, right? And then as I became stationary and devoted time to structures and building and things like that, I can see that flip that
You
you're
switched to
talking about.
plastic arts, right? Like you went from phonic arts or phonetic arts to and experiential arts to plastic and material arts. Is that what you
Yeah.
mean? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I want to tie it back to this core inversion of the fundamental nature of matter as it pertains to space and time. As I'm thinking about it, it seems like one of the reasons we're so compelled by the idea of space and time is because we interpret matter, and therefore there needs to be a container for that matter. But that's really based on a materialist perspective, sort of like what you were alluding to, Topher. At the smallest level, it's billiard balls interacting, which is that's really a framework. But when you dig down at the small levels, you don't have that. Even mainstream physicists will say that 99.999% of the atom's empty space. And if you talk to Stephen A. Young, theoretical physics PhD, who wrote A Fool's Wisdom, he thinks atomism itself, that 0.0001%, that's not there either. And the reason we believe it's there is because of misinterpretations of old studies, like this notion of an electron cloud. That's just one interpretation of certain results. And he ties things back to the elements: earth, air, fire, water.
Definitely.
And everything's actually just not really tangible. It's all energetic, but we perceive and then superimpose physicality on it.
Well, that's what I was talking about.
My conversations with Stephen Young is what put me on quality versus quantity to begin with.
Yeah.
I had the light bulb moment in a life-changing way from talking to him about the elements specifically, because atomism is saying quantity creates quality, whereas the element thesis, if you want to call it that, is that the qualities of these elements condense into the matter. And it makes perfect sense.
And that was my initial training in Ayurvedic medicine, is that's what we're focusing on, is the 4 elements. You know, whether a person's vata, pitta, or kapha, and like you're actually going into the qualitative experience of it. And this is what was so, that's why I'll never give up body work, even though it can be a loss leader for me, is because the coolest thing in body work is if you have some wherewithal in your own self of what your body expresses as from an elemental perspective, the way your body is going to interact with another body is very specific because of how those elemental energies will interact. For example, I'm Pitta Kapha, so I have a lot of fire and earth energy. When I work on somebody that is another Pitta Kapha, it's like an inferno occurs. But let's say I work on a Vata Kapha person, a person that's dominant air and like water and earth, and I work on them, I could work on them like it could look like a very strenuous session, but my body won't generate nearly the qualitative fire that it was when I was working on somebody that was, you know, ultra fire. So this is something that's very, very, I'm totally in tune with. I don't think that there's actual, like I did a podcast with Tom Cowan that I call him the particleist, because he's totally racist against particles, and I believe him. And it's so funny because he's like, there's no evidence. They're like, people talk about DNA. There's literally no DNA. When you look at, whenever you go very small or very large, all you're getting are abstractions from the mechanisms that are actually trying to find these things. But you don't actually get the thing that you're looking for. And that gets back to the whole thing with like, who and what are we?
Well, then back to your weave about how, you know, the previous generation of physicists had a recognition that something about their consciousness affected the outcome of their machinery. And I've come across this with a lot of inventors that I've looked at myself, where they created some device that did some amazing thing, but then they died and no one else could get it to work. because it was really them that was doing it through this device. So if you applied that to the idea of, molecular biology, how much is happening in their viewfinder based on what they think they're going to find, and the machine itself, creating that bias. So there's like there's a gap that cannot be crossed between the materialist quantitative belief system of we're going to find it in the stuff itself, and you can never convince someone that actually these qualities of existence pre-exist the matter until someone has it's like that's maybe where the free will is at, because you have to have the epiphany or the choice made that you're going to see life this way. And then once you do, it's like you live it's like a bifurcation of humanity going on right now. People live in two completely different universes, it feels like.
Yeah, it creates basic problems with epistemology. Just how can we know things? And even at the level of the scientific method, which tries to control for everything, because that has a physicalist bias. But if consciousness is affecting things, then it's like we're assuming in every study that C consciousness equals 0, but that's not the way reality actually works, in which case we've got confounding variables in every study where maybe the experimenter, sort of like you're alluding, Chance, is affecting the results of the experiment in some way, or maybe the participant.
And that's also a part of the Kali Yuga. That's like why I think we're in the Kali Yuga, is because there cannot be consensus in the Kali Yuga. It's impossible. There is no consensus. Like there's literally like the bifurcation and the disintegration of the consensus comes to a complete thing where there isn't consensus. Like that's not something that can occur. I think consensus is a fairy tale anyway.
Well, that's the reign of quantity right there, is that like the majority has it. It's all about
Right.
the numbers.
Right.
Also, I found out that there's like folkloric beliefs of farmers and shepherds that if you count your animals too frequently, then they die more. More of them die. So think about that with the shepherds of men and all the census taking,
Well, that's census in and of itself. And I know I've talked to you about this, Chance. Census data is utter bullshit, especially when you get into third world countries. Like the way they take censuses is just like, they're not paying. It's horrible. There isn't a scientific method in the census taking, at least in the few countries that I witnessed it in. It lends to the notion that there might not be as many eyes out there as we're told that there are.
Yeah, I think we should be questioning everything. If we're told something is true, we need to ask, how did someone arrive at that?
Definitely.
Well, and if we are going to be completely real about the ramifications of our de-inverting the primary fallacy of, the reign of quantity, then we have to take into account the whole replication crisis with so-called science, and that the idea of measuring things, statistics, all of the above being a valid avenue to know a thing is, in my opinion, shaky at best, wrong more likely. Like that any number, like what's the number of facts that support a theory that are required for that theory to be proven true? You could have all the facts in the world, but there's still a possibility that you're wrong and that those facts are actually evidence of something else. And when we go into the world of mathematics, there's such a thing as a proof. Abstractions in math and algebra, you can actually create a proof in like X equals Y, and it's done deal. You proved it, foolproof. But that doesn't apply to life in the same way. There's no proofs in life that are exactly mathematically airtight, no matter how many facts you get. So, it's great to look at the science and research and studies. And I think that, they can point us in the direction of something more profound, but to put all our eggs in that basket as being why we do or don't believe a thing is so sketchy.
Definitely.
But it's
Like, it makes
challenging
me
to
think of
overcome
Bill
that.
Gates with the book How to Lie with Statistics behind him during cooties.
But Chance, you're basically going against the entire academic apparatus, the way they think and the way they train people to think about how to verify things. There's this bias of certainty, this bias of materialism, where people can't even see the assumptions and presuppositions embedded in their beliefs.
Yeah,
And I
that
think you do a good
that
job as like a bridge builder between the two worlds, Mark, because there are people that do need to see things couched in data to even entertain an idea. But did anybody ever have like an aha moment in a life-changing spiritual consciousness expansion from looking at a white paper? Or was it when, they were holding a crystal and it vibrated in their hands like a like which it's experiential.
Yeah, quickly, and then I'll let you go, Topher. I find that people have the strongest transformations when it's experiential like that, whether it's psychedelics or other things too. But there is the intellectual path, and I have had that on my own where I read paper after paper and the logic in my mind went through and I was like, wait, I have to shift my thinking. So it was much more gradual. And I have heard from some people that have read my books where it was like they needed that first domino. And I noticed that when I had that first domino myself, I did have synchronicities. And then I started to work with psychics who could do things. So I was having light experiences or indirect ones. And so there is that path. It's not as strong, but there is a big percentage of the world that's in the system that might need it.
I honestly, there's a lot of my path that involve that. They call it in the East jnana yoga. It's like the path,
Nana.
the intellectual path.
It's Nana yoga.
Well, when I looked it up, it had a tilde over the N, which is a nya sound as far as I know. But hey, I'm not a Hindustani, so I don't know.
Yeah, in southern India, where that's the main thing that they teach is Nana yoga, they call it Nana. There's the path of
This guy's
Nana.
been to India. This guy. Okay. This guy.
Yeah,
Inversions.
there's either the path of Nana or the path of Bhakti, but it's kind of funny. All Nana resolves into Bhakti, which gets back to quality over quantity. Because the Bhakti experience, the experience of devotion, is the experiential throughput line to the quality of a life lived with God. Whereas, the Nana path is I'm trying to fucking figure it out. I'm going to get the statistics and I'm going to get all the gnosis and I'm going to figure it out. And it's a circle jerk because what we are all looking for is the return to the qualitative union with the Most High. Like whether you know it or not, that's the eschaton that we all are awaiting. And so, yeah, the Nana yogi, the joke in most of the joke that the most of the Nanis tell is by the end of your gnosis process, you resolve into devotion. So you should just start into devotion now.
Mm-hmm. Right, because the knowledge leads you to realize that it's most rational to be devotional. Once
Exactly.
you've gotten rid of everything else through the neti principle of not this, not that.
Exactly.
Through knowledge, you're led there.
Yeah, and that's the thing is at the end of the day, what do we take with us? We take our relationships. And in our relationships, how good were we to other? And like that goes back to Jesus, like, love your neighbor as you love yourself. Like that Christ principle is what sets us free from the trap of gnosis. You could figure out all the stuff, all the angles, all the numbers, all the gematria, the geometry, the architecture, all this stuff. And it could give you like little glimpses, but the qualitative experience of I'm loving you and I'm selfless with you, and there's this reciprocation that occurs, that's what it's about. Like, at least from my perspective, like that's what my nonopath is resolved into.
I'm with you, Topher, and where I run into conflicts or paradoxes is when expressing love or truth to someone could actually lead to their suffering.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? To have to be honest with someone, let's say it's in having to fire someone in work, or like having to get a divorce or something. You might be doing it out of love because of the way that you're perceiving the situation and know it's what's best for you and therefore best for them, but it could lead to their suffering. And that would seem on the surface to contradict the notion of wanting to treat people well through love, but maybe it is treating them well in
No,
level.
it's totally treating them well, because I see this all the time. Like, I deal with people that have a lot of entrainment issues. And so they're running programs that they don't even, they're unconscious to the fact that they're running a program. They think it's their actual energy, their thought form, but they're just literally running the program. And so the role I've had in a lot of people's lives is kind of shocking them out of their entrainment programs. And that looks very brutal. That looks like I'm not being loving. But the fact of the matter is, it's just releasing an idol. It's just letting go of an idol. And if you help anybody release an idol, especially if they're giving you the permission to release that release, you're doing them a great benefit, whether they know it or not.
Yeah, idols. They don't move. They're idle.
Right.
It's stuckness. It's not an energetic thing. It's
And the plane,
scarcity.
and that's the thing about the plane of inertia. I mean, inertia is like, an object wants to stay at rest. In physics, like we're on the plane of inertia. Like, that's like we've slowed down a bunch to be here in the quote unquote appearance of materiality. We have become idle. Like, we're idle. So there is something to the brilliance of that double entendre of a word of idle and idol. Like the second you don't have an idol here, I don't think you're here.
Yeah,
many of them are subconscious and just so deeply programmed.
Yeah.
The wordplay being divine revelation, I think, is such a real concept. That's why I love those shows I've done with John McHugh, where he explores that concept that he says the Sumerians called Lumashi. But they happen all the time for me. Like the fact that I realized stress and rest are anagrams for each other. It's just, you would spell rest with two S's. It's the exact same. It's the same word as stress. Like, which is your energy source? Now, I'm going to take a moment here, as we're near the end, and I'm opening a box. This is basically an impromptu advertisement for Tippecanoe Herbs, my favorite affiliate. So let's see what I got in here.
Tippecanoe. What?
All right, he always sends me extra stuff, so we're going to check it out. This is some baby butt salve. It's for the baby's butt. Didn't order this, but it's really good stuff, and we're running low. So thank you, Kyle. Coconut oil infused with calendula, plantain, rose, beeswax, vitamin E. We got here my favorite tea in the world, called Updog. This is your coffee replacement, and it will boost your mood and your energy. Peppermint, yerba mate, linden flower, nettle leaf for those kidneys, Cassandra berry, cardamom, guarana. I probably got 2 of those in here. So what else we got? Baby bump tea. We are not pregnant again, but this nutritional tea right here with nettle, oat straw, raspberry leaf, alfalfa, and rosehip also serves as a great remedy, we've discovered, for like headaches, congestion, lymph flow issues, all around. Just a super nutrifying tea. And looks like we got some bonus items. Might be a little hard to get to. I only ordered the teas as far as I know. Dream on, roll on. This has got blue lotus and mugwort and blue chamomile. Whoa. Dream, get in touch with your dream guides. I'm showing you guys all this stuff because I really want you to check out Kyle's website. He is one of my best buds in the world, and we're always comparing notes on tuning sessions because he's doing that now too. Wow, Dreamweaver. Holy crap. This must be stuff he made for Pisces season. Dream stuff. But this is another mugwort, chamomile, red osier dogwood. All right. Enhancing vivid recollection of dreams and visions. Bam. So if you guys go to Tippecanoe Herbs, which I'm going to put a link in the chats for, and you put in Inverse as your checkout code, you get 10% off. These are medicines that are based in the qualitative approach to life, the qualities or virtues of these plants distilled in alchemical processes. It's completely the dragon that the allopathic system is chasing, trying to find the chemicals that give these plants their magic effects. Well, it's really more wrapped up in the essential qualities of these plants as they express through the patterns that they demonstrate, their shapes, when they grow, where they grow, their tendencies, their behaviors. It's awesome. Got so many good episodes with Kyle talking about the virtues of plants in the backlog. Go check them out, especially the Astro Herbalism series. But for sure, Tippecanoe Herbs, I want to give him a shout out because the package arrived while I was in this stream. So why not do a little unboxing? But other than that, we're at a good point to, start into some closing thoughts. I know there's really no closing this can of worms. It's like, it's the big question, the open-ended question that drives probably all three of us through life, right?
Yes, it appears that way.
Feels like there is no close to this.
No clothes. I have clothes on above and below the camera.
The nudist philosopher.
What about you, Topher? You got any thoughts left hanging, dangling chads as we call it?
My chads are dangling nice and low right now. No, I love this conversation. It's been the number one thing I've looked into, for 30 years, the last 30 years of my life. The whole notion of who am I, the big question, and then that begets the questions of space and time and all these other things. So I love this conversation, and I'm really happy that I got to have this conversation with you both about it.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you, Chance, for setting it up. And Topher, great to meet you.
Very nice meeting you too, Mark.
So there was one thing that didn't really fit in to the topics that we spontaneously got into, but I had said I was going to show it. So I'm just going to show it. I have a listener in our Telegram chat that does, amateur stargazing. And there's a lot of Mars action going on right now, like astrologically. So this is what Mars looks like. It doesn't look like something you could land on. That's why I wanted to show it. Does that look like something you could land on? Does it look like a solid object?
It's the sonoluminescent aspect of your conflict orientation.
You can hear my Mars-ruled daughter shouting in the other room right now.
Yeah, I love describing Mars to my clients, especially when I'm working on their bodies and seeing certain transits through certain aspects of their body. It's the aspect of you that likes conflict. Let's just say that.
Yeah. So thank you, Logan, for posting these in the Telegram group. He puts them in here every once in a while, and it's just like, it's nice to have somebody that you know and trust showing you through their scope what it really looks like, because this is not the image that we get on TV of the so-called planets. So other than that, I got nothing really to add other than, check the description for links to both Mark and Topher's websites. They've done a lot of great work in their respective directions, And look forward to talking to each of these gentlemen again sometime in the future. And Topher, thanks for holding my baby and getting her to take a nap on Sunday.
My pleasure.
I just love hanging out with you guys.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah. Interversepodcast.com/sound-healing if you want to find out more about biofield tuning, which I talked a lot about in this episode. So maybe somebody's curious. But with that.
Yeah. Well, can I interject too? Like I'm doing, because I always forget to plug what I'm doing. I do the celestic profiles for people. So if people would like to know their relationship to those sonoluminescent luminaries that are up there, and how that interaction corresponds to your daily qualitative life, you can go ahead and book on my website at topherhq.com.
And what about your books, Mark? You got anything to plug other than the books? People should definitely be picking those up.
Yeah, they're all on Amazon. There are 7 of them. It's the Upside Down series, and they're available in hard copy, Kindle, and Audible formats. I narrate all the Audibles. And I also have a podcast series, which is just 8 episodes. It's called Where's My Mind from 2019, and it's a bingeable thing you can get through pretty quickly. And it's on near-death experiences, children with past life memories, psychic abilities. I interviewed many of the scientists who study these things. Where is my mind?
Yeah, and I'll say about my Mark's Upside Down book series, you know, especially the virology one and the cosmology one. In particular, those 2 are being my favorites, but all of them, they take material that you might be in rabbit holes over for months or years and pare the information down to a digestible form that would be like the ideal entry-level book or the ideal fact resource if you just needed like a compendium to pull things out of to make an argument or to present a case. So either to hand it to somebody that's becoming open to the topic of the shape of the earth or the virology question, or for your own like Control F search resource to find specific evidence-based, arguments that you to persuade the people that need that kind of thing. They're really good books. They're very, very digestible. I enjoyed all of them. So it's been a great show, guys. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and look forward to the next time I see both of you.
Awesome, Chance. See you, Mark.
See you guys. Thank you.
Bye.